Matthew, a magnate immersed in his own world of wealth and disdain for the less fortunate, had the habit of dining at the Grand Elegance, an upscale restaurant in New York known for attracting the city's elite. On this particular evening, the dining room was illuminated by sparkling chandeliers, casting dancing shadows over mahogany tables. Waiters, dressed impeccably in their uniforms, skillfully moved among the patrons, attending to every request with silent efficiency. In the most prestigious corner of the restaurant, Matthew sat exuding an aura of authority and wealth in a bespoke suit. He smiled arrogantly and waved to a waiter. "Another Bordeaux, please, and don't forget only the best for Matthew Grant," he said ostentatiously, winking as he handed over a $100 bill. As he savored his expensive wine, his eyes landed on a family sitting a few tables away. They were dressed simply but elegantly, quietly enjoying their meal, a rare occasion of celebration. The father, a middle-aged man with gray hair, shared stories with his two children while the mother smiled affectionately, interacting with them. The family's joy and simplicity seemed out of place in the luxurious restaurant setting. With a malicious smile, Matthew began to weave his web of contempt. Seated at his preferred table, he leaned toward his friends, a wicked gleam in his eyes. "Look at that family over there," he whispered discreetly, pointing to the peacefully dining group. "They seem so out of place here, like fish out of water." His friends, somewhat uncomfortable, exchanged glances, but no one dared to interrupt. Raising his voice to ensure his words reached the family's ears, Matthew started hurling insults. "It's amazing how some people try so hard to seem sophisticated, but in the end, they're just simple imitators," he laughed, relishing the situation. The family, initially absorbed in their conversation, couldn't help but notice Matthew's words. The father, with a look of dismay, tried to distract the children by sharing funny stories, but it was impossible to ignore the taunts. "Matthew didn't give up. Look at how they tried to mimic our manners. I bet they don't even know the difference between a Bordeaux and a Merlot," he mocked, eliciting forced laughs from some of his friends. The mother, trying to maintain composure, leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Don't let him spoil our evening. Ignore him." But the tension was palpable. The children looked around, feeling visibly uncomfortable and embarrassed. Emboldened by the lack of resistance, Matthew continued, "Imagine, they probably think vinegar is a fancy drink," he said, laughing loudly, his voice echoing throughout the restaurant. The waiter, approaching Matthew's table to serve more wine, heard the comments and felt a pang in his heart. He knew the family. They were regular customers and always kind and respectful. Professionalism prevented him from intervening, but the injustice of the situation deeply bothered him. Meanwhile, the family's father, trying to maintain dignity, raised his glass and said in a low but firm voice, "Let's toast to our family, our unity, and our ability to overcome ignorance with grace." They toasted, a silent act of resistance against Matthew's cruelty. Matthew, realizing the family's peaceful defiance, felt a twinge of frustration. He wanted a reaction, a confrontation, but all he received was an example of strength and dignity that he couldn't comprehend. The night continued with Matthew's words growing increasingly bitter, but the family maintained their composure, facing adversity with a grace that was foreign to the magnate. In the refined ambience of the Grand Elegance, the family's indifference to Matthew's provocations only seemed to stoke his flames of cruelty further. Sitting at his usual table, Matthew watched with increasing irritation as the family maintained their composure, enjoying their meal as if he didn't exist. "I guess they're not getting the hints," Matthew sarcastically murmured to his table companions, who exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react to this escalating hostility. In a surge of growing anger, Matthew picked up a piece of bread and, with a malicious smile, discreetly tossed it in the family's direction. The bread landed near the youngest son's plate, who looked at it with a surprised and confused expression. "Oops, looks like my bread slipped," Matthew exclaimed loudly, forcing a laugh. His unpleasant action drew the attention of other patrons, who began to murmur disapprovingly. The family's father, trying to keep the peace, picked up the piece of bread and calmly said to his son, "Looks like someone played a little joke. Don't worry, keep eating." The mother shot a reproachful look in Matthew's direction, but chose not to respond verbally. Unhappy with the lack of a dramatic reaction, Matthew, now clearly frustrated, grabbed a handful of vegetables from his plate and, with a swift motion, flung them in the family's direction. The vegetables scattered across their table, staining the tablecloth and dishes. One of the nearby patrons, an elderly gentleman with a look of disdain, turned to Matthew and said loudly, "Young man, your conduct is absolutely unacceptable. This is not behavior befitting of this establishment or any civilized place." The restaurant staff, now fully aware of the situation, approached Matthew's table, led by the manager. "Mr. Grant, I ask that you restrain yourself. This kind of behavior is not tolerated here," the manager said, his voice firm but controlled. Matthew, surprised to be reprimanded, tried to mask his embarrassment with an arrogant smile. "I'm just having a bit of fun. They're not even reacting. I don't see what the problem is." The family, in the meantime, quietly got up, with the father placing some bills on the table to cover the bill. "Let's go, children. There are nicer places to dine," he said, his voice calm but full of dignity. The family left the restaurant with their heads held high, leaving behind a surprised and somewhat unsettled Matthew. He was not accustomed to being confronted, let alone seeing his victims respond with such grace. Other patrons watched the family's departure with expressions of sympathy and respect. The manager, still standing by Matthew's table, regarded him with a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "I hope you reflect on your behavior, Mr. Grant. This is not the kind of experience we want to provide to our customers," he said before walking away, leaving Matthew with his thoughts and the palpable disapproval of the dining room. However, Matthew remained undeterred, considering himself the victor of the battle. If you were in the place of that family, would you do the same, or would you have a confrontation with the arrogant and haughty? Matthew leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile distorting his lips as the serene family walked away from the scene of their humiliation, ignoring the disapproving glances from other tables at the Grand Elegance. He reveled in what he perceived as a display of power and superiority. "Look at that, they ran away like rats," he commented to his friends, laughing with disdain. "That's how you deal with people who don't belong in our world." However, on the fringe of the dining room, one figure remained unmoved, watching the scene with piercing eyes. It was Ellie, one of the most experienced waitresses in the restaurant, who had witnessed the entire episode with growing indignation. Knowing the family that had just left well, Ellie knew something that Matthew was completely unaware of. With determination in her gaze, Ellie approached Matthew's table. "Excuse me, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice calm but laden with intensity that made Matthew turn his attention to her. He stared at her, surprised by her audacity. "What do you want, waitress?" "Another tip to clean up the mess," he sneered. Ellie ignored the provocation. "I believe you made a big mistake tonight," she said. "But it's not me who will teach you the lesson you deserve." Matthew laughed scornfully. "You teach me a lesson? That's hilarious. You don't even know who you're talking to." Ellie held her ground. "No, Mr. Grant. I know exactly who I'm talking to, and I also know something about that family you decided to humiliate. But I believe you'll find out for yourself sooner or later." Matthew looked at her, a hint of curiosity and uncertainty creeping onto his face. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see, Mr. Grant. You'll see that what you did today will come at a cost." With these enigmatic words, Ellie stepped away, leaving Matthew with an uncomfortable sense of uncertainty. As Ellie walked away, she knew she had initiated something that could turn the tide against the arrogant Matthew Grant. She had a plan in mind, one that would reveal the grave mistake Matthew had made in underestimating and humiliating that family. The night at the Grand Elegance was far from over for Matthew, and Ellie knew that the real twist was yet to come. The atmosphere still buzzed with the energy of the earlier confrontation, but now a new tension filled the air, emanating from Matthew Grant. After hearing Ellie's words, Matthew attempted to rejoin the conversation, but his responses were distracted and short. His friends, noticing the change, exchanged worried glances. "Matthew, are you okay? You seem shaken," commented Richard, a businessman and one of Matthew's friends. Matthew forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired, I guess," he replied, avoiding eye contact. "You don't seem the same since what the waitress told you," Cheryl, an elegant socialite, inquired. Matthew shook his head, trying to dispel his doubts. "No, it's nothing. I'm just contemplative, that's all." But the truth was that Matthew was far from just contemplative. The words he had heard echoed in his mind, creating a whirlwind of anxiety and doubt. Who was that family really? What colossal mistake had he made in insulting them? And what consequences would it bring? Unable to shake the unease, Matthew soon lost interest in the conversation and the luxurious surroundings that normally brought him so much pleasure. He looked around the restaurant, seeing everything through a different lens now, no longer the king of his castle but a man confronted with uncertainty. Suddenly, he stood up, interrupting a friend who was telling a story. "I'm sorry, but I need to go. I'm not feeling very well," he announced abruptly. His friends, surprised by his sudden departure, offered looks of concern and parting words. Matthew, however, barely heard them as he made his way to the exit. As he passed by the staff, whom he would normally have handed out generous tips to, he simply walked away in silence, his mind preoccupied with what Ellie had said. His lack of generosity did not go unnoticed. The staff exchanged surprised and worried looks as Matthew left the Grand Elegance. The cold night greeted him, but the chill in his heart was of a different kind, a cold of doubt and apprehension. The night that began with arrogance and disdain ended with restlessness and uncertainty for Matthew Grant, marking an unexpected turning point in his life. In his luxurious penthouse overlooking the city, Matthew found himself in a state of restlessness, unusual for a man accustomed to dominating every aspect of his life. The message received at the Grand Elegance restaurant had triggered a spiral of obsession and anxiety that Matthew couldn't control. Sitting in his spacious living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and artworks, Matthew replayed Ellie's words, trying to decipher their true meaning. "Who is this family? What mistake did I make by insulting them?" he muttered, his voice filled with frustration. Each ring of the phone made his heart race, hoping it would be the supposed father of the humiliated family calling. But as the hours passed and the phone remained silent, Matthew's helplessness intensified. He walked to the window, gazing at the nighttime skyline. "I control businesses. I control people. Why is this situation slipping away from me?" he questioned aloud, his expression reflecting a mixture of anger and discomfort. Unable to find peace, Matthew picked up his phone and dialed one of his friends who had been with him at the restaurant. "Richard, it's Matthew. Do you know anything about that family from the restaurant? Any detail I might have missed?" On the other end of the line, Richard responded with surprise. "Matthew, it's almost midnight. No, I don't know anything about them. Why the concern? I believe the waitress just said that to scare you." Matthew sighed in frustration. "Forget it then. Good night," he said, hanging up quickly. Returning to his seat, Matthew got lost in his thoughts. The arrogance and confidence that had always accompanied him seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a man haunted by doubts and uncertainties. What makes this family so special? And that waitress, Ellie, what does she know that I don't? He wondered, feeling increasingly disturbed by the situation. The night advanced, and Matthew remained awake, unable to find sleep. The image of the serene and united family sharply contrasted with his own loneliness and restlessness. For the first time, the wealth and power that Matthew had always flaunted seemed empty and insufficient in the face of the enigma he was now confronting. The darkness of the night reflected his own internal turmoil, marking the beginning of a journey of introspection and unexpected revelations. The next morning, in his apartment still shrouded in shadows of doubt, Matthew woke up to a new day, but the restlessness from the previous night lingered. As he sipped his coffee, a mixture of anticipation and fear enveloped him. Then his phone rang, breaking the morning silence with its insistent melody. Matthew jumped from his chair, his heart racing. Finally, he got the answer I've been waiting for. He quickly picked up the phone, seeing an unknown number on the display. "This must be the father of the family," he murmured, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. "Hello." On the other end of the line, a male voice responded, "Good morning, Mr. Grant. I hope you've had a reflective night." Matthew furrowed his brow, confused. "Who are you? Is this the father of that family from the restaurant?" The voice chuckled softly. "Oh, not exactly, Mr. Grant. My name is Thomas, Ellie's husband, the waitress from the Grand Elegance." Matthew felt a wave of confusion. "Ellie? What does this have to do with her? What do you want?" Thomas continued, his voice calm but firm. "You'll see, Mr. Grant. My wife and I decided to teach you a lesson. Your cruelty and arrogance at the restaurant did not go unnoticed." Matthew sat down, stunned. "A lesson? What are you talking about?" "The lesson is simple, Mr. Grant. The world doesn't revolve around your wealth or status. Your actions have consequences. You can't belittle people with impunity. We hope this will make you reflect on your attitudes." Matthew gripped the phone tighter, his mind spinning. "Is this some kind of joke? Are you telling me all of this was staged?" Thomas replied, "Not a joke, Mr. Grant, but a mirror to your actions. We hope that in the future, you'll think twice before judging and humiliating others." With these words, Thomas hung up, leaving Matthew alone with his thoughts. The magnate looked at the phone in his hand, the reality of what he had just heard slowly sinking in. The lesson, though cruel, was clear. Respect and empathy were values he had neglected for far too long. That morning marked the beginning of a profound process of self-reflection for Matthew Grant, an uncertain but necessary path toward redemption. As Matthew sat in his spacious living room, still reeling from his conversation with Thomas, the phone rang once again. This time, it was a familiar number. With a dark premonition, Matthew answered. "Hello, Matthew. This is George Sanders." The voice on the other end said, laden with severity. George was one of Matthew's most influential business partners, a man whose support was crucial for many of his ventures. "George, good to hear your voice," Matthew began, trying to keep his composure. "I don't think you'll like what I have to say," George interrupted. "I am extremely disappointed with what I heard about your behavior at the Grand Elegance." Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you hear, George?" "That you publicly humiliated a family. What you probably don't know is that the family was mine. My sister, my brother-in-law, and their children were dining there that night." Matthew fell silent, the revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. "George, I had no idea." There are no excuses that can justify your behavior, Matthew. I'm reevaluating our business agreements. Your unacceptable conduct has not only damaged your image, but also jeopardized the reputation of the companies associated with you. Matthew tried to defend himself, but his words sounded empty even to himself. "George, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," George cut him off. I am informing you that our companies will distance themselves from you and your enterprises. I hope you reflect on your actions. With a click, the call was terminated. Matthew sat there, stunned, the phone still in his hand. The reality of his actions and their consequences began to sink in. The humiliation of George's family was not just a lapse in judgment. It was a professional and personal disaster. In the days that followed, the consequences of his actions became even clearer. Business partners started distancing themselves, projects were canceled, and his reputation in the business world crumbled. News of his conduct at the restaurant spread, tarnishing his name and legacy. Ellie and her husband's lesson was only the beginning of the end for Matthew. He found himself facing massive financial losses and complete demoralization. The arrogance and disrespect he displayed that night at the Grand Elegance became the catalyst for his downfall. Matthew, once a powerful magnate, now faced an uncertain future, learning the hard way the cost of his arrogance and lack of empathy. It was a moment of deep reflection for him, an opportunity for change, but at a price he never imagined having to pay. That was the story. Thank you for watching until the end, and until next time.